and most welcome. This is working. Yes, it's working. Most welcome to 1704 of the Heidegger series. I will today continue my walkthrough of Paul Johnston's Rethinking the Inner. Last time we talked about the two first chapters and this almost obsession of the inner, an ulterior motive, a first cause, what started everything, sort of the big bang of reality, of could you say, of everything that happens. It's instigated by the innerness, the hidden innerness. It is very close to the idea of Big Bang, a hiddenness that causes everything that we can see, so to speak. The classical laws of physics, matter, space, time. Whereas Big Bang is the big hidden. So these tendencies return in different forms, not exactly the same, but it's a similar picture being behind all of them, I'd say. We mentioned also consciousness, also a sort of Big Bang unknown entity that is not the cause, but in some way constantly present in a way we can't enter. We also spoke about thinking. What is thinking? A machine that produces thoughts, that constantly has an activity that goes on and have machine-like products in the form of thoughts consisting of either verbal material, or images. So one could potentially, according to this, make an axiomatic system with thoughts as words and images combined, and that would cover all of thinking. Axioms and theorems. Thinking then would be still unknown, but maybe in some way at least limited. And we also mentioned that there are some clear problems with that idea, and one is most definitely that thinking can come about all of a sudden. The lightning speed of thought, when all is there in a microsecond or no time at all, and it has just entered. But it's a very persistent take on thinking that it is limited at the very outset, after the Big Bang of consciousness. Thinking is just words and images, nothing more and nothing less. And I will now go into the musicality of language. And that is something that is often neglected in philosophy of today. Language is most often seen as just signs for something other, pointing towards the outside hiddenness. The thing in the outside that we cannot directly perceive other than with empirical means. You need to have empiricism to even go out of the bed and manage to go to work. That is the only way, and a lot of philosophers even deny the possibility of perceiving other people's emotions, their mental states. That also turns into a sort of hidden box, but on the outside rather. Still unknown, and the only thing we can know of are the signs. Ferdinand Saussure is an excellent example of this tendency, I would say. because even the signs are mostly something we can't fully understand. Automatic and with no sense in themselves. And if they have no sense, my question is, what can they give us? What do they have in store for us? Steven Pinker is an example of the modern attitude, or the attitude of the last century and a bit more. He says that music is parasitic on the pure signifying capability of language. And music has no possibility of of having a message or representing anything. And I will just take the liberty of sketching out at least a bit before we go into the chapter, the musicality of language. Wittgenstein would rather say that language works as music does, directly, without fragmented pieces like words and sentences. It has almost like the lightning speed of memory, one format. And it plays on the importance of how does a word feel. What is the weight of the word? Is it awkward, frivolous, fitting? Does it more or less come by itself, fluently? Does it have the precise measures for this exact situation, purpose, and place. If that is not music, I don't know what would be. I was sent a very nice YouTube clip yesterday. It was the famed director Bernstein who had a repetition of Elgar's famous Nimrod. And you can see he was speaking to the orchestra. That was most definitely the musicality of language in his gestures, expression, movements, an excellent exposé of the musicality of language. The words that accompanied his conducting, some of them I could understand, but the most of them fully understandable. Only by those who had the familiarity with the piece. Who know how to play the piece already. And that goes to show that familiarity is a feature that is non-extractable from its relation to music or what is happening. Could also be compared that you help somebody reversing her car. In the situation, your gestures can be understood only by the driver. But if you take your face only and what you say, it fails to make any sense. And there is a wonderful example in the book by Johnston about how would it be to teach a Martian how to smile. He will he will have to understand every single thing about us, not skipping one single relation. And in the end, despite millions of years, he might only understand that the gesture of smiling is important to us, and the Martian would, if he has a face, be able to reproduce the smile in a more or less fitting situation. But most of the time his smile will be unsuited, 1 microsecond too early, out of place, not in synchronicity of what others are saying or where he is and what is his intent. Although a rather extreme example, this is very helpful to sort of point out all the gazillion of circumstances that we are so accustomed to. So we're simply not aware of it. We are like a fish swimming in the water, completely unaware of the medium it's in. It cannot know that. Until maybe one day evolution takes him to the shore and make him develop legs so he can see the difference between water and air. And there is a theory, but I think that is called the sing-along theory, that language began in singing. Wittgenstein is not proposing a new theory or an explanation for language. His aim is, as you might recall, descriptive. But if I were to compare them, I would say Wittgenstein goes in the direction there is no idea or purpose in differentiating language from singing. On the contrary, you can call it a gliding scale, a slope, or many times completely indistinguishable. Do remember that there is absolutely music in every speech, even the most monotonous voice have as prosody to it. It's a rather awkward microphone, although it gives a good sound. And now you can probably not hear me. There is a quote from Remarks on the Philosophy of Psychology. Doesn't it matter that I want to say that? Isn't it important? Is it not important that for me hope lives in the breast? Is not this a picture of one or another important bit of human behavior? why does a human being believe a thought comes into his head? Or more correctly, he does not believe it. He lives it. For he clutches at his head. He tilts his head back and makes a movement as a sign that nothing should disturb the process in his head. Now, are these not important kinds of behavior? And here the good point is, and I cannot explain it any better than Johnston. The supreme example of a picture or metaphor that has become embedded in our lives is in fact the picture of the inner itself. Although what we observe is something outer, our reaction to it can only be in terms of the inner. And I think that's extraordinary, very, very apt to the point. And here is another example. Observing an animal, an ape that investigates an object and tears it to pieces. One may say I wonder what is going on in him. How remarkable that is, but not more remarkable than that we say love, conviction are in our hearts. So it's almost inevitable that the inner start knocking on the door, making itself heard as an incredible, pervasive, intrusive, unstoppable picture of how things are related. I mentioned him many times before, but he is a good help as a researcher in artificial intelligence. Rudolf Pfeiffer of Swiss extraction. His machines have their intelligence. His mobiles, his animals, if you like, all their intelligence is in their outside, in their movement and in their construction. There is zero storage in them, but still they learn and still they remember. He shows that only movement, not computer slot memory, can store the enormity of human culture, or animal culture for that matter as well. How the thing moves is its thinking, memory, planning, everything. And it changes imperceptibly, becoming more advanced by itself. It's all in the outside. And by having this picture, we most probably block out a huge part of our world, our lives, our potentiality for understanding things. So a sort of pervasive friction becomes living. And I mentioned previously in 1702 that it in the end takes its toll on us. It's a tough chore to do every day, to even confuse the world itself. And of course, it plays, obviously, parallel to what we've been discussing about memory earlier, that it should be engravings, also stemming from the picture of the inner. And as old as antiquity. They saw memory sometimes as wax, cera, and that wax was inside and it got molded by experience, almost like one of those small blackboards that gets inscribed and then stored away. Copies of what happened. So it's pretty old here in the West. Very persistent picture. And I think, as I mentioned in 1702, is once you start understanding that the picture is more important than words, then you can get into the picture because it decides everything. It's the thing that is calling the shots, although we believe that the words are more decisive. They should be, but as I see it, the picture is more pervasive, stronger, and words cannot compete with what they, so to speak, are not even aware of. Well, we are not aware of it. But it is still words that are used in Wittgenstein to sort of conjure slowly the picture. It needs to be established bit by bit. So it develops into a full picture. Something I would say that the picture itself do not want you to do. Picture tells a message of direct understanding, seeing the whole thing at once. So patience is an absolute predisposition for going into Wittgenstein. If you're not patient, it will not open up. And we are trying to find words that suit the situation, and we weigh them, we feel them in almost like we're trying to taste the peculiarities of different wines to know which is perfect for a piece of Flandre. I read here about Mona Lisa. the idea of a special feeling or atmosphere reflects the strong impression the phrase makes on us. Our sense of having a quite specific significance. To describe the feeling, we would have to find some way of bringing out what the passage means to us. One way of doing this would be to tell a story. Consider, for example, the quite particular expression of the Mona Lisa. When we speak of the enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa, that may well mean we ask ourselves, in what situation, in what story might one smile like that? And so it would be conceivable for someone to find a solution. He tells a story, and we say to ourselves, yes, that is the expression which this character would have assumed here. That point is enormously important. You see here, it's all in the connection. It's all in that particular situation, direction, and purpose that it makes sense to use that particular saying. And to reduce that is horrifying. To say that the comment on Mona Lisa's smile can be said to represent the smile, or can be reduced to be solely a descriptive phrase of the smile of Mona Lisa. A bit like Saussure. And it's an awful way of treating language. It is diminishing it to nothingness. So the idea, there is no ideology of representationalism. It is not a philosophy. It is originally stemming from the misunderstanding itself. And what many people call that the world got split in two is not correct. We are captured by a picture, and that picture does not depict a split. Don't think it that way. It simply doesn't make sense. It is as if a policeman would ask me if I take a left turn when it's a cross on a sign over a left turn, and he would ask me, what did you plan and think? I would say, I made a mistake. I didn't plan this. The same is to answer dualism is no answer. You will eventually understand that you had no idea what you were doing, rather. Put a little pause here. We can go to the next chapter. Thank you very much. So we continue. And we were speaking about the musicality of language. And from there on we will continue. To the next chapter. That is the complexity of the inner. To hold the microphone. So we will continue with the complexity of the inner. And the introducing quotes are often the best ones to put one's energy into. The complexity of the inner. Suppose we were observing the movement of a point, for example, a point of light on a screen. It might be possible to draw important consequences of the most various kinds from the behavior of this point. And what a variety of observations can be made here. The path of the point and certain of its characteristic measures, amplitude and wavelength, for instance, or the velocity and the law according to which it varies, or the number or position of the places at which it changes discontinuously, or the curvature of the path at these places. And innumerable other things. And of these features, its behavior might be the only one to interest us. We might, for example, be indifferent to everything about its movements, except for the numbers of loops it makes in a certain time. And if we were interested not in just one such feature, but in several, each might yield us special information, different in kind from all the rest. This is how it is with the behavior of man, with different characteristic features which we observe in his behavior. And here is, I think, a pretty good pointer to what it's about in the next quote from Remarks on the Philosophy of Psychology. If I now say that the experience of remembering and the experience of pain are different in kind, that is misleading, for experiences of different kinds makes one think, perhaps, of a difference like that between a pain, a tickle, and a feeling of familiarity. Whereas the difference which we are speaking is comparable rather to that between the number 1 and the root of -1. And this is about the oversimplification of the inner. And we call everything experience, and that is then after that stored in memory. Everything gets blocked out. The finesse of what the inner is disappears. Many years ago I went bird watching, and I'm not an ornithologist myself, but a friend who came back one day after an excursion to tell a tale. He had been out in the jungle and just saw some interesting bird, and then he asked some tourists how that bird looked like. They had gotten a better glance at it. And they just said, "Oh, don't bother. It was just some sort of sparrow or similar." And he was so upset by this. This is what we are doing in the common sense understanding of language. We say that everything is experience, when it in reality have all these fantastic nuances, small differences that makes it interesting, intriguing. Makes it so much more than just said, oh, you just had an experience. Oh, it was just a bird. And of course, this is what we do to ourselves. We diminish our livingness and calls it's just a series of experiences. I had one yesterday and I'm going to have one tomorrow. And to help out, Wittgenstein tries to lead us into the complexities using different tools. One could call seeing, hearing, etc. as states of consciousness, and knowing, believing, intending could get the name dispositions as a working name. And the general difference between the two is that one does not need to spot check to determine whether the former are continuing. Indeed, if one needed to do a spot check, this itself would show that the state had been interrupted. So knowing, believing are extensive. But you cannot say that you know for 2 days, but you can say you are looking for 1 day, or maybe more reasonable 1 minute. So these states of consciousness have genuine duration. And he continues, seeing, hearing, tasting are not the only components of the inner which have genuine duration. And hence, it is not surprising that there are other concepts where the notion of content is naturally at home. And when we can here now see that because of the duration, we get the impression that it has a content. And then the step to storing that content is easily done. So what Ludwig is doing is gently showing, although it has duration, and you could actually call what goes on as content, that does not necessarily imply that it is storable or should be stored, and that it is like an experience like everything else. Have a gander at knowing, believing doesn't really have a duration in that sense. Are these also experienceable, or things that eventually could get stored away somehow? Is that even doable? And if it were, would it be fair to diminish all these facets into under one encompassing term? I think it could be helpful here once more to bring in good old Edward de Bono, and this of grouping everything into one he called passive information processing. So it was like everything went into the same slot automatically, without any awareness, skill, knowingness. Whereas compared to active information processing, you do not start out with already established categories or distinctions. You just put in a prior. And that makes everything so much real, so much more real. And in this Wittgensteinian example mentioned here, we can see all these seeing, hearing, touching, knowing, believing, hoping. They all go into the same slot and gets marked by experience. This is how it gets covered up, loses its capability to inform, to tell, to relay things. It's very similar in some aspects to have a disjunct outer world. All of a sudden, all the nice differences falls into a sameness slot. Yeah, it's just the world outside there. What Wittgenstein and Edward de Bono was inviting us to was to open up the slot a bit and see if we can go into its prior, where the terms were actually used in their proper place, or this natural habitat of the word. And once there, you will discover much, much more. Because in that, you are definitely in the complexities of the inner, or the outer, if you prefer that term. And a whole array of features will develop in front of your eyes, ears, knowingness, believingness. There is an example of the differences that usually eludes us. Johnston compares grief and sadness. First problem that arises, there is no use in saying that someone experienced this every 5 minutes or once an hour. As in comparison to a sensation, it could be limited. Sadness has a story and a reference to what the individual is feeling at a particular moment. It has a reason and history, and it is actually part of the world of thought and feelings. And unlike sensation, it manifests itself in the way the individual act. Then we also have the differences between sadness and grief. Grief is more caused by something, an event, and it almost sort of points in the direction that it will end or at least diminish. Sadness doesn't have that. I'm not an English speaker, but I don't feel that it has this ending to it. Could end, but maybe more of a sudden, and maybe not to the same extent caused by something. Could be several events that cause the sadness. But it could pass by itself, whereas grief maybe starts with a high point and then slowly diminishes. Sadness can more probably slowly evolve and then go down. But I'm also aware that these two expressions can be used interchangeably, which does not diminish their differences. So what this picture does now, I hope, becomes clearer. Will still be muddy because we are definitely at the very beginning of getting a grip of these things. But in a way, the picture simplifies away peculiarities, idiosyncrasies of the world and the inner. And what remains, that friction, that uneasiness, could be called dualism, but it's no possibility to say what side is what, because dualism in itself doesn't point to anything. Obviously, its place in language is very, very limited. I saw a dualistic flower the other day. Maybe this can put Edvard de Bono's life project in an interesting new context together with Wittgenstein. Edvard de Bono was largely misunderstood by academia. His ideas did not catch on. With the help of Wittgenstein, they not only makes more sense, they also get larger, expand, become more telling. The passive information system is, in a way, just another word for being held captive by the picture. Yes, it's a simplification of sorts. Sometimes that could be very helpful to make a simplification. To help deal with the other simplifications that haunt the life world and the language game to such an extent. Haunted by these things. Well, we discussed earlier Lakoff and his metaphors we live by and philosophy in the flesh and other publications he made with Johnson. But it's also because of, one could say, by metaphor we get lost in language. We get quantity from comparing height with things piled up. It's one of the examples of Lakoff, which is brilliantly captured how it most probably counting started and the words as that's a high number, and if you think of it, it's a bit odd. But what could happen is that we go even further and we compare love and liquid. And then you can make a competition in a couple who loves who the most. But the concept of love doesn't follow the same as piling up, or if you prefer, a liquid that could be measurable. And of course we do the same today. And I think if you do it with caution, a caution that is almost impossible to achieve, you can stay clear of misunderstandings. But how much happiness do you feel on a scale? Can be helpful in a very limited case, or maybe not at all. My old professor in philosophy went even further, a stern believer in analytical philosophy. He made a diagram with a scale using the XYZ. Of course, I had to be one that didn't work. Just give me a second here. A scale looking like this. And X, Y, you can put in the amount of happiness for each day, like this. Then you can have meridian here to tell how happy you were. I'm not kidding here. Maybe one of the most awful experiences or weirdness. This was truly a weird episode. A false analogy. Or I would say it's not false, it's not working simply. It doesn't make any sense. You're mixing apples and pears. I would call it unhelpful analogies. Language, when it's healthy, is a support. It is something thriving in its multifarious complexities of plurality, not covered over. And hidden. This is that sort of misuse of language hides everything underneath, and it creates a stop from entering into the concepts. Be able to live them. Live by them. And to see all these differences, Wittgenstein also mentions hope. Whereas there are ways of showing the before mentioned sadness and joy, surprise. But hope doesn't really have a clear expression or any expression. So it is quite different in that way. And that difference gets obscured in the same way as this diagram obscures happiness, by comparing it or putting it into the slot. Oh, she had an experience of hope. And here is an important pointer, and that's why this book is so crucial, because Johnston tells us how much force we should take in different paragraphs and sayings of Wittgenstein. And the Wittgensteinian dictum, inner states stand in need of outer criteria, is not a recipe for uniformity, but it is an exhortation to recognize the complexity of the inner. Read further on page 136. Take the various psychological phenomena, thinking, pain, anger, joy, wish, fear, intention, memory, etc. And compare the behavior corresponding to each. That's pointer. They all have what we call here different behavior. They are as different as a tea kettle to a steering wheel. But what does behavior include here? Only the play of facial expression and the gestures. also the surroundings, so to speak, the occasion of this expression. They all have different timing, and some of them do not have timing, and some of them time wouldn't even make sense. If I say I know Swedish, there doesn't seem to be any duration to that. But if I say I know her, it most definitely has some sort of duration. I think humor plays a role here too. Wittgenstein once mentioned, you can write a book about philosophy only using jokes. And I think that is in stark opposition to putting everything into the same slot. When humor comes, it awakens differences in language. See if I can find one in English, but the Swedish one, två bagare och en smet, is playful on two bakers and one dough. But dough also have a secondary meaning of escaping. It has a homonym. And this is the power of language. In this example, it is only the words that are playful, but when you start playing with the picture, the underlying captivating picture that leads to representationalism, whatever that is, or dualism, or any other term we use for these misuses, it becomes something much more stable with humor. It questions the seriousness of the picture. It is almost like an authoritarian father figure, a bit like Stalin. It has a demanding authority over us that we individually give to it. We do not accept the picture on a collective scale, of course, but there are definitely traits of authority and dictatorship with the picture. It demands things that you can't produce. Demands weird stuff not coming from natural habitats of the words. In a way, misusing language is like whipping a foaming horse that already done its work for the day. It won't move anymore, but you continue to whip it and thereby destroy it. That misconception lies in language itself. I think in some context earlier on I mentioned Noam Chomsky. He could work as an example, but beware, it is not Noam Chomsky that is influencing us, or he is an example of the ideology of misunderstanding. There are not such a thing. It's just an exaggerated example so you can get at least a little taste of it. But do not make too much out of it. Could really be that he's no more misusing language in general in his daily doings than we others are. It's not, should not be an object for those, the idea that he is the worst misuser of language. Of course, I have a horn with Chomsky. I was forced to do universal grammar, so there could be some personal background here. Most definitely. And I don't want to, at any case, mislead you. Be careful, strut carefully in the regions of Wittgenstein. This was a pleasure. I don't know why I look at the camera. I should just look straight ahead. But until next time I learn that, and I hope you learn something too together, as I also have. Have a very pleasant morning, day, afternoon, whatever you are in. Bye-bye.